Hello, fellow teachers. This is Ben Wilcox, and welcome to Teaching with Power. Thank you for letting me be a part of your scripture study or your lesson prep this week. My goal, as always, is to help you to study and teach the scriptures with more relevancy and power. This week, we're going to be studying 3 Nephi, chapters 20 through 26, continuing with the teachings of the Savior. And I promised you a few weeks ago that we'd be covering chapter 16 in a future lesson. So we're going to be including that chapter this week because it really fits well thematically with this week's chapters. Remember, teachers, if you're interested in getting access to the materials that I put together for teachers to help reduce your preparation time, increase your confidence in the classroom, and help you to create edifying classroom experiences, just go to teachingwithpower.com and you're going to find links to those resources. Now, if you're ready, grab your scriptures and your marking pencils. It's time to dig deep. All right, now the first icebreaker is going to take just a little bit of prep work to set up. What you need is 100 pennies, or really 100 of anything, but I like to use pennies. And you can put them in a jar or a plastic container, or you really could just leave them in a pile at the front of the classroom. And for fun, you might ask them to make a guess as to how many pennies are in the pile, and then give a reward to whoever gets the closest. But then ask them to open their scriptures to 3 Nephi chapter 26, verse 6, to discover how much of what Jesus taught to the Nephites is actually included in the Book of Mormon. We don't have the full account of everything that was taught by the Savior during those days that he visited them. And there, in that verse, we discover that if we take Mormon literally, not even 100th part. And at that point, as a teacher, reach into the jar and pull out 1 penny. Of all that Jesus taught, this is how much we actually have recorded. Just think of all the other wonderful things that Jesus must have revealed to the Nephites that we don't have in the Book of Mormon. Now, take a quick look at verse 9 in that same chapter. And when they shall have received this, the teachings of Jesus that we do have here in the Book of Mormon, which is expedient that they should have first, to try their faith. And if it shall so be that they shall believe these things, then shall the greater things be made manifest unto them. So Mormon tells us that some of those greater things that Jesus taught would be made manifest in the future. And I imagine that we've got a lot of those things in the Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and in the collective revelations of our modern prophets. But in the Book of Mormon, we've got the 100th part. Now, why is this important? With that in mind, what does that tell us about what Mormon did decide to include then? What does that suggest about these 20 chapters that we have of Jesus' teachings? In my opinion, that suggests that what is there must be the most important things that he felt we should know in the latter days, since the Book of Mormon was specifically written for us. It gives emphasis to what he did decide to include. And that's why I find it very fascinating that there is a message in these chapters that is repeated 3 separate times. We find, basically, the same subject matter in chapter 16, chapter 20, and chapter 21. Does that surprise you? Of all the things that he could have included in that 100th part, he chose to emphasize this particular message 3 times. Now, hopefully I've piqued your curiosity. What is the message? Well, I wish that I could just walk you through each of these chapters verse by verse and just really dig deep into all of the historical and cultural background and the Old Testament symbolism that fills these chapters. But you're not going to have time to do that as a teacher. That's an experience better suited for a personal study of this section. As a teacher, though, our job is to synthesize and to simplify the message so that your students are going to be better prepared to understand and deepen their comprehension of what is taught here. So the way that I approach these chapters is to break it down and summarize its major points into 6 simple words. If you know these 6 words, you're going to have a basic understanding of the message of 3 Nephi 16, 20, and 21. And I'm going to help you to discover those. So here's a brief fill-in-the-blank activity that can help us to do just that. It comes in the form of a handout. And for fun, especially if you're teaching the youth, I do like to have them do this quick word activity first to get them in the right frame of mind. And the key to this first activity is to fill in the blank with the word that rhymes with the other word, the given word, and solves the clue. So here's an example of this. It's kind of fun. If the clue is a headache and the given word is brain, well, what word could you put in the blank that rhymes with brain that would also solve the clue? A headache. A headache is a brain pain. Brain pain. See how that works? Now let's see if you can get these other words. A Band-Aid is a scratch patch. Scratch patch. A joust is a night fight. Gardening would be soil toil. Soil toil. An electrocardiogram is a heart chart. A realtor's job? Well, that would be dwelling selling. That's a little bit of a tougher one. And then, I like this one. Chewbacca's favorite dessert. I guess you got to be a Star Wars fan to get this one. But Chewbacca's favorite dessert would be a Wookiee cookie. All right. That's just for fun. But now to the important blanks to fill in. Here are the phrases with the missing key words. Look up each of the suggested references, and in each, you're going to find the word that fills in that blank and completes the message. And it's important to note that this message is taught in different orders with different details and emphases in these actual chapters. But at least this activity is going to give your students a basic understanding of what's taught here. Now, when they discover the word, I'd encourage them to mark it in each of those verses so that the meaning really stands out. And I know that I usually display the scripture markings with my visuals that actually look like the pages of the scriptures. But since our main focus today is on comparing these different verses in the various chapters, I want you to see them all at once. So I'm going to display them together on one screen. Hope that's okay. But here we go. The first word. In the last days, the Lord will restore the blank of his gospel. The word is fullness. He'll restore the fullness of his gospel. This is a promise that the Lord has made to many prophets of the past. Yes, there was going to be a general apostasy on the earth, but one day he'd bring about a restoration of his truth and his church. Portions and parts of the gospel would be lost through the ages, but a renewed fullness would come forth at some future time. That restoration, of course, began in the year 1820, we'd say, when a young boy decided to seek wisdom in a grove of trees. In chapter 21:6, instead of speaking about the fullness of his gospel, he uses a synonymous phrase for the restoration. Can you find it? He talks about bringing them to the knowledge of the true points of my doctrine. That's the restoration. That's what the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants teach us. That's what's been revealed line upon line, precept upon precept, throughout the history of the church up to the modern day. The true points of his doctrine. So we've been blessed in the latter days with the fullness of his gospel. Now, with the restoration of that fullness, what's the next step? Our next phrase. He will then gather his people from the four quarters of the earth. That's the major work of the latter days. The gathering of Israel. In his first big talk to the youth of the church, what was the subject that President Nelson emphasized? The gathering of Israel and the youth's role in accomplishing it, calling them to be a part of the great youth battalion. And most of what we do in this church is focused on the gathering. We gather by doing missionary work. We gather by perfecting saints, ministry. We gather by redeeming the dead through temple work. And President Nelson said, anytime you do anything that helps anyone on either side of the veil take a step toward making covenants with God and receiving their essential baptismal and temple ordinances, you are helping to gather Israel. It is as simple as that. Our calling, our mission, our duty then is to gather. And there's another synonym word that we could throw in here to add to the idea of gathering, and it appears 11 times in chapter 21. And the word is work. The gathering of Israel is a great work for us to accomplish. What kind of work is it, though? Is it backbreaking work? Mind-numbing work? Busy work? No. Verse 9 calls it a great and marvelous work. If you've ever sincerely taken part in any aspect of the gathering of Israel, you probably know what he's talking about. It is great. It is marvelous. Our next word then. For this work of gathering, he will give them a blank for their inheritance. He will give them a land for their inheritance. What's the land being talked about here? America. At least to provide them with a starting point for the gathering. We know from the Doctrine and Covenants that God played the decisive role in the creation of the United States. And why? Because the United States is better, more favored by God than any other country? No, that's not it at all. It's so that there could be a land where a freedom of religion would allow for the restored church to be established and eventually flourish. There really wasn't any other area in the world at that time where the restoration could have been established without being squashed by authoritarian governments, monarchies, or dominant religions. If you want more detail on that idea and that process, you could watch my video for 1 Nephi 11 through 15, where an angel explains all of this very clearly to Nephi. And maybe you recall that lesson from earlier this year. This is the vision where the angel shows Nephi different specific scenes from American history leading up to the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ in the latter days. Fascinating topic. Our next word, then, the Gentiles, or anyone who accepts the fullness, will be blank among his people. Numbered among his people. The gospel's for everyone. Nobody is excluded. Remember that Jesus is a one-by-one deity. Therefore, it shouldn't surprise us that he numbers his people. Nobody escapes his attention. So as we endeavor to gather Israel, if they accept, they'll be numbered. Every year in General Conference, the church statistical report is read. Now that might seem just like business, right? Maybe we don't pay much attention. But that act, right, is a powerful reminder that we, as a church, literally number and record every individual who's made a covenant to follow Christ. Records are important in this church, and anybody who wishes to be a part of the church is going to be accepted and numbered among his people. So, who do we seek to include in our missionary efforts on both sides of the veil? All peoples, all nations, all cultures, all are alike unto God. We gather, we number. And next, together they will build what? Zion, the city of the saints. In early church history, Zion was seen and understood as more of an actual physical location. Kirtland, Ohio, Independence, Missouri, Nauvoo, Illinois, Salt Lake City, Utah. These were all seen and referred to as Zion, a central gathering place for the saints. My ancestors from Denmark and Italy and England, after being converted by missionaries, all made the harrowing journey across the ocean and the American continent to gather to Zion. And there's another title for Zion that you could mark in these verses. And what's that name? The New Jerusalem. Now, our understanding and definition of what constitutes Zion, or the New Jerusalem, has evolved. When the church was new and small, there was safety and strength in gathering physically into one location. The times have changed. We don't need that physical closeness to survive and thrive. Advances in communication and travel make it less necessary for us all to be bodily together. So now we define Zion by its stakes. We've kind of entered a new phase of the building of Zion. Wherever we have a stake or district or ward or branch, or where two are gathered together in his name, that's Zion. And Zion has now been established in countries all over the world. It's more of an idea than a central location, which is important for us because that way we're able to spread our influence and example all over the world. Therefore, every time we attend a church meeting, every time we fulfill our callings, every time we minister, every time we pay our tithing or do family history work, every time we set a good example to our neighbors, our coworkers, our communities, we're building Zion. So now the last word. We know what will happen to those who respond positively to the fullness of the gospel, who allow themselves to be gathered to this land. They're numbered, they're called to help build Zion. But what about those who reject the fullness or oppose it? What's their fate? Our last phrase, any that seek to oppose this work will be blank down, like a lion among sheep. That imagery of the lion is going to come up often. They will be tread down like a lion among sheep. Now, what on earth could that mean? Sounds violent, doesn't it? And I really don't think it means that church members are encouraged to engage in acts of retaliation against those that refuse to accept the fullness or oppose it. Rather, let me suggest a few possible interpretations here. It could be a message to those who attempt to stop the growth and progress of the church, the building of Zion. Trying to do that is like trying to stop a lion amidst a flock of sheep. The lion is going to tear right through them. They don't even stand a chance. Another image is used in chapter 20, verses 18 through 19, where a man gathers sheaves together and a bull comes in with brass hooves and stomps on them, separating the wheat from the chaff. And there are other images that suggest the same idea in other places in the scriptures. You're probably familiar with the one that's introduced in the book of Daniel, where we hear King Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the little stone cut out of the mountain without hands that rolls forth, gaining size and momentum until it breaks in pieces all the kingdoms of the world and fills the whole earth. Doctrine and Covenants 65 refers to that same dream in reference to the Latter-day Church of Christ. And then I love the image that God gives to Joseph Smith in Doctrine and Covenants 121, verse 33, where he says, "How long can rolling waters remain impure? What power shall stay the heavens? As well might man stretch forth his puny arm to stop the Missouri River in its decreed course, or to turn it upstream, as to hinder the Almighty from pouring down knowledge from heaven upon the heads of the Latter-day Saints." It's all the same message. And that message is, you can't stop the church from growing. It's like trying to stop a lion with sheep, like trying to stop a bull from separating wheat as he treads the sheathing floor, like trying to stop a giant rolling stone with a statue, like trying to stop a giant river with your puny arm. It's not going to work. If you try to stop the rolling stone, you're going to be crushed by it. If you try to fight the lion, you're going to be tread down by it. Now, maybe just a little personal story that drove this point home for me one time. I remember on my mission in Brazil, the time that the most popular news program in the country did a report entitled "The Mormons of Utah." And almost everybody watched this news program. Unfortunately, the program wasn't even about the church. It was about the fundamentalists down in southern Utah, with all of the reports at that time of abuse and scandal. But the program never differentiated between that and the actual Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I'll never forget this. I was talking to one of the stalwart members of the church in that area, and he was so distraught. And he said, "This is going to destroy the church in Brazil." Well, I ask you, did that news report destroy the church in Brazil? I'm happy to report that it didn't. In fact, that very next week, 2 families were baptized into the ward. There wasn't even a blip in the growth of the church. The lion was not deterred. The stone was not stopped. So protesters at General Conference, anti-church websites and books, social crusaders, and apostate groups have never succeeded in stopping the growth of the church. Brigham Young once said that when people kick the church, they only succeed in kicking it upstairs. Now, if those images of the lion or the stomping bull still bother you a bit, let's soften it a little by showing you some other places in the scriptures where the saints are compared to these animals. It's not always necessarily a confrontational comparison. Isaiah compared Latter-day missionaries to young lions in Isaiah 5:29. But listen to how he describes what the lions do with their prey. "Their roaring shall be like a lion. They shall roar like young lions. Yea, they shall roar, and lay hold of the prey, and shall carry it away safe. And none shall deliver it." They carry it away safe, not allowing anybody else to come and take it away. As for the bull with brass hooves, another Old Testament prophecy can be found in Deuteronomy 33:17. "His glory is like the firstling of his bullock, and his horns are like the horns of unicorns." That's a bad translation, by the way. That's referring to desert goats or ibexes. "With them he shall push the people together to the ends of the earth. And they are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh." This is just one place in the scriptures where members of the church are compared to livestock animals with horns. And with those horns, they push things. An animal's horns are its tools. And here they're used to push people together. Those horns and hooves are tools for gathering. The Doctrine and Covenants refers to this idea in Doctrine and Covenants 58:45, where the Lord's speaking to the elders of Israel. "For behold, they shall push the people together from the ends of the earth." Also, consider the symbolism of the baptismal font found in our temples. What animal bears up the weight of the font? 12 oxen, animals with horns and hooves. And they carry the responsibility for that work on their backs. They shoulder that duty, facing out in all directions to bring salvation to all, living and dead. So do you see how those images can be interpreted? And then we get yet another image for the church's growth. We'll go ahead and pull this out of chapter 22 here. 3 Nephi 22, 2 through 3. A tent. It's Jesus quoting Isaiah again. Lots of Isaiah here, all right? Enlarge the place of thy tent, and let them stretch forth the curtains of thy habitations. Spare not, lengthen thy cords, and strengthen thy stakes. For thou shalt break forth on the right hand and on the left, and thy seed shall inherit the Gentiles, and make the desolate cities to be inhabited. So here, the church is spreading across the earth like a giant tent. Now, I'm a backpacker, so I know that the more stakes you drive down, the stronger your tent is going to be. Maybe you've wondered why we call them the stakes of the church, or why we go to a stake center for stake conference. When those that aren't members of the church hear us use that language, it's probably going to confuse them a bit. The stake center? Should I bring my knife and A1 sauce with me? But that's not why we call them that. Stake, S-T-A-K-E, not S-T-E-A-K. And it's because of this prophecy right here. So many people are going to join the church that they're going to break forth out of the tent to the left and to the right. The curtains are going to have to be stretched, the cords lengthened, the stakes strengthened. More and more are going to be pounded in all around the world. So, are we beginning to understand why Mormon decided to emphasize this particular message for us in the Book of Mormon here? Likening the scriptures here. He felt that we really needed to understand this. Why? Why do you feel this 6-phrased message is so key for you and me? Well, I think it's because it describes our great part to play in the unfolding story of God's work and glory amongst His children. We've been called and chosen to gather as many of God's children as possible to His church before the second coming of Christ. Not because we're better than anybody else, but because we're needed. I like the way my cousin Jared Halverson puts it. Exclusivity in the pursuit of inclusivity. We're trying to bring together into the great tent of Christ's church all that will listen, all that will respond. It's the great work of the latter days. And President Nelson obviously gets it, and he's emphasized this message too. Now, if you have time as a teacher and you wish to further accentuate and hopefully inspire with this idea, I love the story that Wilford Woodruff shares about a special priesthood meeting held in a little 14 by 14 foot log schoolhouse in Kirtland. And perhaps with this, an object lesson recommendation. I'll often measure out a 14 by 14 foot square in my classroom, mark it with masking tape so that they can visualize that space on the floor. I tell them that this story took place in a building that size. And at that time, that square could fit all the priesthood holders of the entire church. Now compare that to a modern-day priesthood session held in the massive conference center that, even with its immense size, can only hold a small fraction of the worldwide priesthood body. That setting is key to the story. And here's what Wilford Woodruff describes what happened in that log structure. On Sunday night, the prophet called on all who held the priesthood to gather into the little log schoolhouse they had there. It was a small house, perhaps 14 feet square, but it held the whole of the priesthood of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, who were then in the town of Kirtland, and who had gathered together to go off in Zion's camp. That was the first time I ever saw Oliver Cowdery or heard him speak. The first time I ever saw Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball and the two Pratts and Orson Hyde and many others. There were no apostles in the church then except Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery. When we got together, the prophet called upon the elders of Israel with him to bear testimony of this work. Those that I have named spoke, and a good many that I have not named bore their testimonies. When they got through, the prophet said, "Brethren, I have been very much edified and instructed in your testimonies here tonight. But I want to say to you before the Lord that you know no more concerning the destinies of the church and kingdom than a babe upon its mother's lap. You don't comprehend it." I was rather surprised. He said, "It is only a little handful of priesthood you see here tonight. But this church will fill the Rocky Mountains. It will fill North and South America. It will fill the world." Now, what an incredibly bold statement for Joseph to make in those circumstances, in that setting, when the church was so small, to make a prophecy of global proportions. Really something. Some might even say presumptuous. But he turned out to be prophetic, didn't he? And you know what? You know what I'd really like to know? I want to know what Joseph saw that night. What was the vision that he had of the church? What was he seeing? Obviously, it extended far beyond those circumstances. Did he see our day? Was that what he was looking at? I wonder what would happen if Joseph came to my ward this Sunday and we held a testimony meeting. And maybe we'd get up and we'd testify of how amazing the progress of the church has been since his day. Maybe we'd triumphantly testify of a conference center filled with priesthood holders, 17 million members, 335 announced or dedicated temples, or 67,000 full-time missionaries, or the fact that we have congregations in 160 different countries worldwide. Now, I'm not sure, but I just wonder if Joseph would then walk up to the pulpit and say, "Brethren and sisters, I have been very much edified and instructed in your testimonies here today. But I want to say to you before the Lord that you know no more concerning the destinies of the church and kingdom than a babe upon its mother's lap. You don't comprehend it. This church will fill the world." So what did he see that night? Maybe far beyond what we can even fathom now. 50 million members? 500,000 missionaries? 1,000 temples? Congregations in every single country on the planet? I don't know. But I imagine we'd be surprised if we could tap into that same vision on that night, given in a little 14 by 14 foot log schoolhouse in the obscure town of Kirtland, Ohio in 1834. For our truth slide, then, I just reiterate that 6-phrase summary of the chapters. In the last days, the Lord will restore the fullness of his gospel. He will then gather his people from the 4 quarters of the earth and give them a land for their inheritance. Anyone that accepts the fullness will be numbered among his people. Together they will build Zion, the New Jerusalem, and any that seek to oppose this work will be tread down like a lion among sheep. Taking it to heart, what are some of the most exciting church milestones that you've witnessed as a member of the church in your lifetime? And what gathering experiences have you enjoyed in your life? Then a simple I will go and do. As we've studied today, have you felt inspired by the Spirit to do anything because of what you've learned? Who knows? Maybe that inspires us to get out and share the gospel more, to serve a mission, to go to the temple, to do more family history work, to minister to the other members of our ward, to do some service. There's so many ways that the Spirit can inspire us to continue this great and marvelous work. So to conclude this portion of this week's lesson, a well-known but stirring quote from Joseph Smith. "The standard of truth has been erected. No unhallowed hand can stop the work from progressing. Persecutions may rage, mobs may combine, armies may assemble, calumny may defame. But the truth of God will go forth boldly, nobly, and independent, till it has penetrated every continent, visited every clime, swept every country, and sounded in every ear, till the purposes of God shall be accomplished, and the great Jehovah shall say, the work is done. Brothers and sisters, do you feel the power and the momentum of the message of those chapters? Do you understand now why Mormon would include that 3 times in this 100th part of what Jesus taught? Yes, we may live in a very difficult and challenging time to be a disciple of Christ. But wow, we are so fortunate too. It's an amazing time to be alive, to be a believer. We've got work to do, a great and marvelous work. We get the privilege of participating in the great gathering of God, to gather God's children far and wide, male and female, living and dead, and together build up Zion in preparation for the coming of Christ. So every missionary effort, every temple visit, every ministering endeavor, every seed of influence that we plant through our example makes up part of this great work. So may we all rise to the occasion, follow the lead of our great prophet, president, who is so single-mindedly dedicated to this mission. Thrust in our sickles with our might until the great Jehovah shall say, the work is done. Well, speaking of opposition to the church and opposition in general, 3 Nephi 22 contains a beautiful message of comfort to all of the Lord's servants. It's from Isaiah, again, Isaiah 54 to be exact. And in verse 17, he says that this chapter represents the heritage of the servants of the Lord. So for any that struggle, any that are bowed down by the burdens of life, that find themselves discouraged by the opposition they face, 3 Nephi 22 is like a healing balm for the troubled. I like to leave this chapter very open-ended with my students and just ask one simple question. What's your favorite message of comfort from this chapter, and why? Give them time to read it. It's not that long. And then let them share. And some of my personal favorites, verse 7, for a small moment have I forsaken thee, but with great mercies will I gather thee. Verse 10, for the mountains shall depart, and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord that hath mercy on thee. Verse 13, and all thy children shall be taught of the Lord, and great shall be the peace of thy children. Comforting message for parents there. And then verse 17, no weapon that is formed against thee shall prosper, and every tongue that shall revile against thee in judgment thou shalt condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord. Now, I believe that if you allow your students some time to study and ponder that chapter, that's going to lead to a meaningful and personal discussion of God's comforting and merciful nature. And you know, there's a very powerful piece of music written by Rob Gardner, a composer and member of the church, that takes a number of the verses from this chapter and sets them to music. It's really beautiful. It's really well done, and could make for a poignant moment of self-reflection in a gospel class. And it's entitled, My Kindness Shall Not Depart From Thee. So I'm going to include a link to that video in the video description below. It's going to take you to where you can listen to that piece of music. And I hope you enjoy it. But moving on, for an object, for 3 Nephi 24, I like to bring in a bucket of 10 oranges and then a glass of orange juice. But you know, you could bring in 10 of any fruit or juice that you desire. But I wouldn't display those objects just yet. And for an icebreaker, I like to start this next section with the following quote and challenge. Something said by President Joseph F. Smith. He said, by this principle, the loyalty of the people of this church shall be put to the test. By this principle it shall be known who is for the kingdom of God and who is against it. By this principle it shall be seen whose hearts are set on doing the will of God and keeping his commandments, thereby sanctifying the land of Zion unto God, and who are opposed to this principle and have cut themselves off from the blessings of Zion. There is a great deal of importance connected with this principle, for by it shall be known whether we are faithful or unfaithful. So here's my question. What is the principle that he's talking about here? Is it temple attendance, scripture study, honesty, humility? Now, if you need a hint, go to 3 Nephi chapter 24, verse 8. And what's the principle? Tithing. Tithing is the principle that President Smith is referring to. And I call this principle a litmus test commandment, because I really don't think that it's the most important commandment that we can keep. But like Joseph F. Smith says, it's a good indicator of those who are really for the building up of Zion and those who may only be partially committed. I call it the great separator. Now in 3 Nephi chapter 24, Jesus quotes Malachi chapter 3 almost word for word. And Malachi had some important things to say about tithing. And I think it's significant that Joseph F. Smith said that this principle would be a separating one, because that's exactly the same perspective that Malachi takes. Malachi begins by speaking about the second coming, and he asks a question in verses 2 and 3. But who may abide the day of his coming? And who shall stand when he appeareth? For he is like a refiner's fire, and like fuller's soap. And he shall sit as a refiner and purifier of silver. And he shall purify the sons of Levi, and purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer unto the Lord an offering in righteousness. So the initial question that Malachi is posing here is, who's going to survive the second coming? Who's going to abide it? Because when he comes, only the pure will remain. The second coming will separate and purge the silver and gold from the dross. Tithing, apparently, is part of that separating, purging process. That truth is clearly taught in Doctrine and Covenants 64, verse 23. Behold, now it is called today until the coming of the Son of Man. And verily, it is a day of sacrifice, and a day for the tithing of my people. For he that is tithed shall not be burned at my coming. Now, because of this verse, I've heard some people jokingly refer to tithing as fire insurance. And though I do think that it provides us with spiritual protection, I feel that tithing is so much more than that. It's not something that we do because we fear some future painful calamity. In fact, I often refer to tithing not only as the great separator, but as the greatest deal ever offered to man. Let's go deeper on this. To begin, a question. What does Malachi compare not paying your tithing to in 3 Nephi 24, verses 8 and 9? And there it says, Will a man rob God? Yet ye have robbed me. But ye say, Wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Ye are cursed with the curse, for ye have robbed me, even this whole nation. So not paying our tithing is like robbing God. Now, I can imagine somebody taking issue with that and saying, all right, hey now, if I don't pay my tithing, you could accuse me of not being supportive or that I'm unwilling to sacrifice. But robbing God? How am I robbing him? That's my money, right, from my paycheck that I earned. So I'm not robbing anybody. How would we answer that? Well, I like to go to Doctrine and Covenants 104, verses 14 through 50. I, the Lord, stretched out the heavens and built the earth, my very handiwork, and all things therein are mine. And it is my purpose to provide for my saints, for all things are mine. So the answer to that argument is that all things really do belong to God. And this is a critical starting point for our discussion on tithing. Because if we don't believe that truth, none of the rest of the points are going to work for us. This is the foundational principle. All things come from God. All things were created by God. All things belong to God. So I'd say to that person who was arguing with the principle, well, who blessed you with a healthy body that makes it possible for you to work? Who sent you to the type of situation in life where you could get an education, which made it possible for you to get that job? Who blessed you with your mind that allows you to work the way you do and earn what you do? Or King Benjamin's suggestion, who gave you your life and is lending you breath from day to day and moment to moment? Who created this world and its abundance? Really, when it comes down to it, all things really are God's. He's just allowing us to use them and be stewards of them. Now, until we come to that realization, paying our tithing is always going to be difficult. And hopefully we can see why, right? If I look at it as God's money, He's only asking for 10% of what's His. And He's graciously offering us 90% of what's His. If I look at my paycheck like that, then I can easily say, oh, Lord, you want 10% of your money? Well, sure, I'll give you what's already yours. And I get to hold on to the 90? Wow, that's very gracious of you. Sometimes for fun, to make that point, I ask if anybody has any cash on them in the class. Usually somebody does. And I ask if I can see it. They give it to me. And then I turn to another person in the class, hand them the money, and I say, here you go. It's yours. And then I say, see, look how easy it was to give away somebody else's money. It wasn't hard for me at all. I can give away your money all day, and it doesn't affect me. But if it's my money, that's a little bit harder to do. So start there. All things are God's, and all He asks is 10% of what's already His. Back to 3 Nephi 24, verse 10. Malachi is going to tell us what God uses that 10% for. I mean, do we send that money to God Himself? Like we put it in a rocket ship and send it off to Kolob? No, what's God going to do with that money, with that sacrifice? Is there some big money bin in Salt Lake where they just hold on to all of it until the millennium, and then God can collect His due? Nah, that's not it. What does the beginning of verse 10 tell us the purpose of tithing is? Well, it's so that there may be meat in my house. Now, what does that mean? It's so that God can have a way to run and maintain His house, His church. In a temporal world, even the church has temporal needs. So what's tithing money used for? To maintain the church, to build chapels and temples, and then continuously maintain those buildings, pay the electric bills, the heating and cooling systems, landscaping to keep the grounds beautiful and conducive to the Spirit, to print hymn books and lesson materials, to provide religious education for the youth, to run church programs, to make it possible for my kids to go and build their faith at an FSY activity every other year. And then I like to ask this. We say that we're paying tithing to God, but really, who uses the churches and temples? Who uses the hymn books and lesson manuals? Who benefits from the religious education and other church programs and has their kids go to FSY? We do. God doesn't take those things for Himself. He gives it right back, just in a different form. It's looking like a pretty amazing deal, isn't it? I love how it says in verse 10, the phrase, prove me now herewith. In other words, put me to the test. Like we thought tithing was our test, but really it's a test for God. He's saying, put me to the test, people. Just see if I bless you. Am I a God that keeps His promises? Prove me, test me. Let's see what happens. And then the deal doesn't stop there. It gets even better. Because He says, you know what? Since you're so willing to sacrifice and give up 10% of what actually belongs to me, I'm going to bless you for that. I'm going to give back more than you gave. Now, I ask my students to look for all the blessings that God promises to those who offer their tithes, and look for those promises in verses 10 through 12. I see at least 4. He will open the windows of heaven and pour out a blessing that there shall not be room enough to receive it. I love that imagery. I picture that above everybody's home, there's a horizontal window directly above it. And when we offer our tithing, God calls out to the angels, "Open the windows of heaven for the Jones family." And the angels, they pull the lever, and whoosh, the windows drop open and out pours the blessings on that house. And we're like, I'm drowning in blessings down here. There's not going to even be room enough to receive it. Now that can mean temporal blessings, prosperity. But I'm not so sure that that's really the spirit of it. When most of us hear the word blessings, we immediately go to temporal blessings. I'm so blessed because I have a home and a job and food to eat and clothing to wear. I think that's a big part of it. That is a part of it. But a pretty limited view of blessings. More importantly, blessings include truth, personal guidance and revelation, happiness, gospel knowledge, comfort, confidence, protection from evil, weaknesses turning into strengths, on and on. These are the real and most important blessings of life. Gordon B. Hinckley once said, "I do not say that if you pay an honest tithing, you will realize your dream of a fine house, a Rolls Royce, and a condominium in Hawaii. The Lord will open the windows of heaven according to our need and not according to our greed. If we're paying tithing to get rich, we're doing it for the wrong reasons." I believe that faithful paying of our tithing will provide us with temporal blessings. But more importantly, it will increase our spiritual blessings. They'll be poured out upon us. A second blessing in verse 11, "I will rebuke the devourer for your sakes." And in this case, I don't believe that the devourer is Satan. That's not the symbolism here. I think it's another power. And if you read the rest of the verse, I think there's a clue. "He shall not destroy the fruits of your ground, neither shall your vine cast her fruit before the time in the fields." I think the devourer is time. Time will not devour your goods. He'll rebuke it, hold it back, not destroy. I think God is still going to work within the realm of reasonable reality, though. But I think it could mean that things will last longer for us. You'll get more use out of them. Your clothing, your investments, your material possessions. I had an uncle who owned a truck that he used for his business. And he put 400,000 miles on that truck without any major repairs needing to be done. Other than routine maintenance costs, that truck just lasted and lasted and lasted. God rebuked the devourer of time. My uncle, he called it his tithing truck because he sincerely believed that God was blessing him in that way because of his commitment to tithing. My parents' washer and dryer lasted for 25 years before it needed to be replaced. They attributed that to tithing. And I've seen that in my life too. We've got things that have lasted well beyond what was expected. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you pay your tithing, you're never going to have to do repairs. There's never going to be unforeseen costs or financial issues in your life. I just believe that those kinds of things are going to be fewer and far between, less, if we faithfully make that sacrifice. The devourer will be rebuked and held back for our benefit. And we may not even realize the blessings that we're being given because we just can't know what would have happened otherwise. What accidents didn't happen? What things didn't break down? What pitfalls were avoided? I think it would be cool to someday have those things revealed to us. These invisible blessings. Maybe God will sit us down in the next life and say, Hey, do you remember this situation? Did you know what would have happened? I blessed you. I made that thing last longer. I protected you from this circumstance. And we'll finally know and have a perfect knowledge of all of God's graciousness and his help. In verse 12, all nations shall call you blessed. We'll stand out. Our commitment will be recognized and admired by others. And who knows, people from outside the church may say, wow, look at those members of the Church of Jesus Christ. Did you know they paid 10% of everything they make to their church? That's dedication. Maybe there is something to them and their message. So perhaps tithing can be a missionary tool. And then finally, one more blessing. Ye shall be a delightsome land. It's another blessing for tithing, happiness. God will give you a more delightsome life. Not a trouble-free one, but a happy one. And I believe that's true. I feel that the paying of tithing has been key in giving me what I consider to be a delightsome life. I hope that these verses have brought you to the conclusion that I've come to about tithing, that it's actually the greatest deal that we've ever been offered in life. When we look at it this way, it's hard to even consider tithing to be a sacrifice. And while teaching, if you feel your class is still not quite grasping these concepts, you could try this little object lesson that I've used to great effect. Or you could do the object lesson piece by piece as you're going through the preceding verses and the principles that we just covered. But what I do is I go out and I buy 10 oranges, place them in a bucket. I tell my class to imagine the following scenario. You're walking down the street and a friend walks up to you and he says, hey, I want to make a deal with you. And you say, okay, what is it? And now from behind his back, he pulls out a bucket of 10 oranges. And he wants to know if you want them. I'll give you these 10 oranges. And you say, well, sure, but what's the catch? And your friend says, well, I'll give them to you, but, and you're like, oh, here it comes. I only ask that you give me one of them back. And you look questioningly at them and you say, you mean I can have the other 9 and you just want me to give one back? And they say, yep, that's it. Deal or no deal? And you say, okay, deal. They hand you the bucket and you pluck one of them out and say, here you go. Now that's our first tithing principle, right? All things are God's. And he blesses us with all of that because all things are his. And all he asks for is 10%. But as you're going to walk away, your friend stops you and says, hang on. And now you're like, oh, okay, here it comes. Now comes the catch. He runs around the corner, and with that orange that you gave him, he peels it, he juices it, and he comes back with a giant glass of orange juice and says, I want you to have this with that orange you gave me. And he hands you the glass of orange juice. And see, that's our second principle of tithing. He gives it right back, right? But he gives it back to us in a different form. In the blessings of the church, the church buildings and temple experiences and FSY and religious education and hymn books and all those things. Now you're about to walk away with your bucket of 9 oranges in one hand and your glass of orange juice in the other when he stops you again and says, hang on, one more thing. I'm so impressed that you would be willing to make that kind of deal with me, that you would give me back that one orange. So grateful for your sacrifice. You know what I'd like to do for you? And he whistles, and you hear a truck backing up. Beep, beep, beep. And the bed of the truck starts to lift, and out pours a giant pile of more oranges, burying you in them, so much that you don't have room enough to receive them. You look at your friend who's got a giant smile on his face, and he says, pleasure doing business with you. And he turns and walks away. Now, if that kind of thing really happened to you, wouldn't you say, that was a pretty good deal? Yeah, the greatest deal you've probably ever made. That's tithing. He's going to pour out the blessings of heaven from his windows when we are willing to make that special offering. Simple truth, if I pay my tithing, the Lord will pour out temporal and spiritual blessings upon me. Taking it to heart, which of the 4 blessings have you seen come into your life through tithing? And then an additional activity that you could do as a handout that I found effective is to invite your students to write a brief response. Invite them to fill in a few sentences with how they would respond now if a friend said the following to them. Tithing is ridiculous. The church asks way too much of us. Now, what would you say to that friend to help them to understand the purpose of this law? And for me, I feel greatly indebted to the law of tithing. I'm so convinced of its power in my life. I've had so many experiences that I wouldn't dare stop making that offering. I don't think I could afford it. We can't afford not to pay our tithing. And I don't have any of those amazing stories where I had to choose between paying my bills or paying my tithing, and then I paid it, and then a check appeared out of nowhere. Those kinds of things do happen. I've heard those stories, and they're wonderful manifestations of these principles. But nothing like that's ever happened to me. But here's my experience with tithing. I've found that as I've made that offering throughout my life, I've never known a day of want in my life. God has blessed me immeasurably, spiritually and temporally. And I believe spiritually more than temporally, but certainly the windows of heaven have poured out their abundance upon me and my family. And I believe, and I bear witness that the Lord will do the same for you through a commitment to this greatest of all deals. All right, now, chapter 25. I'm going to skip it this time. And the reason why is that in a couple of months, we're going to be covering the truths of this chapter in great depth in Doctrine and Covenants, section 2. I mean, this prophecy, this is the one about sending Elijah before the great and dreadful day of the Lord, who's then going to turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the heart of the children to their fathers. That prophecy is found in every single standard work. It's in Malachi 4, 5, and 6 in the Old Testament. It's in Luke 1, 16 through 17 in the New Testament. In 3 Nephi 25, 5 through 6 right here in the Book of Mormon. Doctrine and Covenants, section 2. And it's even in the tiny Pearl of Great Price in Joseph Smith History 1, 37 through 39. That suggests how important this prophecy must be. So I invite you to just hang in there a little while, and I promise that we're going to dig deep into this doctrine next January. And I hope that's okay. But if you were planning on teaching that doctrine here, and you want some of my thoughts and ideas, then, I'll direct you to my Doctrine and Covenants 2 video from a couple of years ago. And in that video, I do go into great depth on this prophecy. And I'll provide you with the link to that video in the video description below. But there is one final thought from chapter 26 that I'd like to just briefly touch on here. In the last part of that chapter, you've got this wonderful scene where Christ looses the tongues of the children, and even little babies begin to speak and teach. And they teach great things to the people, things even greater than Jesus taught. I read that and I have to ask myself, why? Why did he do that? What lesson was he trying to teach them and us? So I try to visualize it. How would I feel as a parent if my toddler daughter or son turned to me after I'd taught a lesson and said, that was great, Dad, but I'd like to teach you some deeper things about the gospel that I don't think you quite understand yet. Or can you imagine if you had an infant in your arms and it turned its little innocent face up to you and said, Mom, Dad, I'd really like to teach you some things about the plan of salvation that I think you've misunderstood. Well, that's the experience the Nephites had. Do you think that they could ever look at that child in the same way after that? Whenever you looked into their faces, you'd remember the incredible wisdom that came out of their mouths. I think this is one of the greatest lessons on humility that's ever been taught. Perhaps it reminds us that even the wisest of us can learn from the simplest. So we should all be willing to listen as well as share. One of my favorite things about being a teacher is when my students teach me. And they do. I'll be honest with you, and I'll admit that many of the insights that I teach on this channel have come from things that I've learned from students over the years. We've got to be willing to learn as teachers, as well as teach. And from somebody who has taught the scriptures for many years, I know that sometimes even teaching the gospel can be a temptation to pride. Maybe we get a little too used to hearing the sound of our own voices say important things. So whenever I'm tempted to feel that pride, I remember this story in 3 Nephi. What greater way of teaching and demonstrating humility than what Christ is doing here? He allowed them to teach even greater things than he himself had taught. I think most of us would want to teach the most beautiful truths or the best stories or the most important lessons, save those for ourselves. I feel that way sometimes. I'm the gospel doctrine teacher in my ward, but I share that calling with another teacher, and we switch off every other time. And sometimes I admit I get a little jealous about what he gets to teach and that I don't. And I'm like, oh, I wanted to teach that chapter. I wanted to teach that story. We like to teach what we consider to be the greatest things. But Christ allowed the perceived least among the people, the little children, to teach the highest and deepest and most beautiful things. Now, I pray that we can remain teachable teachers and that we'll be willing to open our ears as well as our mouths. And that's gonna conclude our lesson for this week. I hope that you felt the Spirit. I hope that you gained something from this experience. And if you did, I encourage you to share it with somebody else that you feel it could help. I'm so grateful for the fact that all of you join me each week to allow me to share my love of the scriptures with you. Now get out there and teach with power.